Welcome back, guys. Chris here. And in this video, I want to talk to you about migrating onto NetSuite from your earlier system, regardless of whether it's QuickBooks, Sage, Xero, etc. How do you bring your information from your old system over onto NetSuite, which is really just a piece of the implementation process, but is certainly a major aspect of it. And you're going to get all kinds of companies, some that are small and trying to navigate their migration and implementation almost on their own, and then other companies where they're much larger and they are partnered with a consulting company, but they have such huge data repositories and in some cases requirements or at least desires to bring over as much information as possible. So that's all understandable. I get it, but there are some things that you should think with when you're going through that data migration process. So in this video, we're going to be covering some tips and tricks as well as some pitfalls to avoid when you're navigating that migration process. And we're going to start off with the pitfalls. And the first one I want to give you is pretty general, but it's just the concept of not having unrealistic expectations. And while that does sound general, I will, as we go through this video, I'll start to specify different elements of unreal expectations. But the general thing to keep in mind is you don't want to have the impression that everything can be brought over, or that the migration process can be done very easily, or that it can be done very inexpensively. Those are simply not feasible. Of course, the only way you can achieve a quick or very cheap migration is if you bring over almost no data. Very few companies want to do that. So you have to understand that there is a balance. If you want to bring over not even a lot of information, but just even a significant or what I would consider a sensible amount of information from your old system to your new, that can take an extremely long amount of time in terms of man hours, as well as it can rack up costs, especially if you're dealing with a consulting agency. So as we go through the video, I will give you more specificity on what you should have as your expectations. But the first pitfall you just want to avoid from the get-go is don't go in with a very rosy or optimistic viewpoint of what that migration process is going to look like. The second pitfall that you should absolutely avoid, this is the main one that I bring up with people, is you want to understand that you are not going to be bringing over, in almost every situation, you're not going to bring over all your GL transactions, all your invoices or sales orders, POs, etc. All of these historical records, which often number in the thousands. Generally speaking, you will not be able to bring those over into NetSuite. Many clients are shocked to hear that. They don't understand. They have all this information in QuickBooks. They do not understand why they can't just do a transfer and import into NetSuite. Now, there are many reasons that tends to not be feasible. It certainly is possible. Anything is possible. But when you're looking at the parameters of time and money, it becomes less and less possible. And the difficulties that you can run into when you're doing that kind of an import are myriad. You can run into issues. First off, the way that things are categorized in NetSuite, which is one of the main reasons people go onto NetSuite, is you have segmentation like departments, classes, subsidiaries, locations, etc., custom segments that you can add in, as opposed to something like QuickBooks where you've only got classes. And sometimes people are creating like a bloated chart of accounts with all these unique accounts to account for various aspects of it, or to try to segment things further within the confines of their QuickBooks account. When you're dealing with those parameters and then you're going to try to bring things into NetSuite, it's just not going to hook up appropriately. It's going to take a lot of time to try to go through every transaction, make sure that you didn't just jam classes in QuickBooks, utilizing it to try to account for, let's say, locations or departments or something else, that when you get into NetSuite, it's not going to link those things up appropriately. So you're going to have to go through and you're going to have to rework thousands and thousands of lines of transactions. It often becomes completely unrealistic. So think with that. Generally, I would recommend to most clients that they think with bringing over up until the beginning of this fiscal year, all of the trial balances month by month until the beginning of the fiscal year. So if you're halfway through the year, think back to, let's say it's January, good. Think back till January, bring over those 6 trial balances. Sometimes if people are trying to do that implementation right near the end of the year, then I would just take that full previous year, bring over those trial balances. And that, even in its own right, is no simple task. Bring over trial balance can have all kinds of things go wrong. What's called the mapping of the different accounts can be very problematic. So You just need to think with the fact that your chart of accounts is going to be different in QuickBooks compared to NetSuite. Your segmentation is going to be different. It's very time consuming to bring over transactions, and it's a little bit of a all or nothing approach. So if you're going to decide you want to bring over some, you often have to bring everything over. And I have seen some clients do that, but those are clients that have billions of dollars in revenue. And they look at it and they go, yes, I am 100% willing to accept, in some cases, $100,000 of consulting fees to go through the information, make sure it's properly formatted, and then bring that into the NetSuite account. So if you have that kind of budget and the timeline that's going to be needed to accomplish that successfully, then great. Most clients don't. So think with what you can do instead of that. And in some cases, it's very common, especially if you're coming off QuickBooks, to have your NetSuite instance running where you're bringing over those trial balances. And then in parallel, you are still running QuickBooks minimally until go live, and then sometimes even after go live, to make sure that some of the open transactions can be carried over at their appropriate times and nothing's crashing. The business is able to continue running appropriately. So that is without question the biggest pitfall I would avoid. The next one is not nearly as problematic, but it is something that most people don't think with, which is if you are doing a lot of customizations in your system, especially related to things like entity records or transaction records, etc., you want to think with the sequence of events in terms of when are you bringing over that information and then when are you going to apply the customizations. Sometimes people can cause problems for themselves if they heavily customize various forms and things in NetSuite before they've even brought over things like their list of customers. You don't have those customizations necessarily in QuickBooks. You start customizing things to the nines in your NetSuite account, then you bring over information, and sometimes that can cause issues if there are a bunch of new fields that are not incorporated or accounted for in your existing records. So just be aware of that. Think with that process of when are you doing customizations in relation to that data migration process. Next, let's move on to the tips for doing a data migration. And the first and probably the most important one is scrub, or what some people know as clean your data. It is so important to make sure that when you're bringing over information in NetSuite, you go through it systematically and methodically to make sure the information is accurate. You've probably heard the phrase, the system is only as useful as the information you're feeding into it. So if you bring over a lot of duplicate records with inconsistencies or incorrect fields, wrong mappings, etc., you're going to have problems in your system and you're going to start off on the wrong foot. So it's very important. And actually, more often than not, what really happens is not that you just have wrong data in the system, but it's going to cripple the system and make it not work appropriately. So what happens is you try to rush it, or inconsistencies are made, you bring over information, when you're doing the testing, you find these things are bugging or they're not working appropriately, then you have to have someone go through and re-look through the information, re-scrub it, re-import it. It adds a lot of additional time, and frankly, when it comes to implementations, time is not only means you're pressing that go live date, but it often means money as well, because you're paying that consulting company to do the work that you guys should have done in the first place. So if I've just alluded to it, the concept is when it comes to cleaning and scrubbing data, unless you have an unlimited budget to pay some consulting company to do it for you, you generally want to have your guys do that scrubbing process. And if you're not going to import the data yourself, then you can have the consultants do the import, or at least show you how to do the import process, and then you can do a lot of the heavy lifting on that. That's a great way to try to reduce your consulting costs, is make sure that you organize amongst your team to scrub your data appropriately and do as much of the heavy lifting on the import as you possibly can. Now, second tip is once you have scrubbed the data and you've brought it into the system, you want to extensively test things, because it's very easy to overlook inconsistencies, duplicate records, etc., that were brought into the system. And when you don't do appropriate testing, you go live with a system that's going to have tons of problems and will break in certain areas that can make your business really suffer. So the rule of thumb is anything that you bring in, you want to make sure you extensively test it. And let's say you're talking about lists of vendors or employees or customers, etc. When it comes to testing, it can be as simple as making saved searches with the proper parameters, or you could say criteria and results, that are going to come up or should come up with all the customers that you brought into the system. So you know on one end from QuickBooks what what should be reflecting in NetSuite. You make the appropriate saved search and it should come up with exactly the same amount of people that you had when you were in QuickBooks. If something doesn't come up, well, then you've got problems. Things are not coming in appropriately. You can find out what the issue is and try to resolve it. The third tip I have for you is try to rely on external IDs whenever possible. If you don't know what the concept of an external ID is, when you're in NetSuite, NetSuite will automatically and instantly attribute what's called an internal ID to any kind of record, whether it's a transaction record, it's an entity record like a customer. It will give it an internal ID like 1, 2, 3, etc. It'll start counting along. An external ID is another number that can be attributed to one of these records, especially when you're talking about transaction records. These transaction records already have identification numbers in whatever system you had before, and anything that is now going to be brought in or at least reconciled in the system, you can bring over that external ID, and it's generally recommended to do so, especially if you're working with something like customer records. Then when you're dealing with those customer records, each one of them will have an external ID in, let's say, QuickBooks. Well, instead of running into problems with the formatting of the name, like was it ABC Inc. or was it ABC, Inc.? Well, that can easily cause a duplicate record, or it can cause a problem in the system where things are just not spelled correctly or it's not matching up with something else. So instead of relying on account names, customer names, etc., it's better to just try to import using the primary column being that external ID, and it makes it very easy to make sure that numbers are correctly reflected. You bring those in, you use those as your key. It can make the process much, much simpler. And the last tip I have is not so important for data migrations. This is more just for importing in general. If you're not already familiar with VLOOKUP tool or XLOOKUP, I highly recommend you get familiar with those. Just like I gave an explanation with external IDs, you can use things like external IDs and internal IDs to rely on what's already in the NetSuite system to be able to bring in new information, or more importantly, bring in existing information and update those records using things like VLOOKUP, XLOOKUP. I could go into a whole explanation of what those things are. I've already done entire videos on VLOOKUP, and there's plenty of videos online that show you how to use XLOOKUP, which is often the preferred method. So you can check those out, take advantage of those tutorials, utilize those tools to have your import process go as smoothly as possible. So those are just a few quick tips and tricks, as well as some pitfalls to avoid in relation to data migration. Hopefully this video was helpful for you. If it was, please hit that like button. If you want to see more videos like this, definitely hit subscribe. And with all that in mind, I hope to see you in the next video.